Welcome to the Zcash Ecosystem Grant Funding panel. This panel is comprised of individuals who have all held or hold important roles in the Zcash funding ecosystem. The Zcash Foundation provides administrative support for the Zcash Community Grants program, ZCG, and ZF runs the Minor Grants program in consultation with ZCAP. ZCG funds independent teams entering the Zcash ecosystem to perform major ongoing development or other work for the public good of the Zcash ecosystem. The ECC Filecoin Grants program focuses on projects that lead to additional utility for the FIL and ZEC chains and their respective ecosystems. Individuals and teams have multiple options when it comes to requesting funds for projects that support and grow the Zcash ecosystem. Grant funding not only supports the development of Zcash, it also contributes to decentralization within the protocol. These programs have successfully funded a wide range of projects, including research and development, educational initiatives, and community support. However, there is still room for improvement in the efficiency and impact of these programs. So let's kick off this panel. To start, please introduce yourself and explain your connection to the Zcash grant ecosystem. You want to start, ML?
Sure. My name is Michelle Lai. I go by ML on the forums. I was on the first ZCG. At the time, we were known as the ZOMG, the Zcash Open Major Grants Committee. Since then, I've stayed involved on the forums. I come in from a enterprise crypto side of things. I used to work at Anchorage, Bitpay, and Copper, but now I work in infrastructure and DeFi investing and advising.
I'm Josh Whitehart. Good to see you all. I work at ECC through tomorrow afternoon. In part of my work at ECC, we had been working with the Filecoin Foundation on a grants program where Filecoin had provided about $5 million worth of funding. And so that's kind of my connection, and independent of being just an independent community member, interested in our kind of broader grants ecosystem.
I'm Amber O'Hearn. I'm a current member of the ZCG since January, and I've been a Zcash zealot from the very beginning, but this is the first time I've been directly involved.
And I'm Aditya Bharadwaj. I lead Nighthawk Apps, an independent, non-US based team to develop, maintain infrastructure, services, and apps for the Zcash ecosystem. I've served on the ZCG committee in 2022 and have seen both the sides of the coin, writing grant proposals and evaluating them. So I'm honored to be on this panel.
And I'm Alex Bornstein. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Zcash Foundation, and I'm in charge of operations. We provide grant support or administrative support to ZCG and the Minor Grants program. So we provide the back-end support for all the grants that ZCG provides. This is an awesome panel filled with former grant committee members, current member, a community member, and then a grantee and a former member. So we kind of cover every single angle of the grants community at this point. So for this, the first question is in line with the theme of this year's conference, which is the future has not been written. So I want to start off by considering a fundamental question. What are your thoughts on the current state of grant funding in the Zcash ecosystem, and what are some steps that we can take to improve the efficiency and impact of these programs? Michelle, would you like to start?
I think Aditya and Amber should start since they're current.
Okay, that sounds good.
And then I'll supplement based on the delta I've seen.
Okay, perfect. Amber?
Well, it's a very wide-reaching question.
It is.
I think that in general, we're doing an excellent job just based on the things that have come out, everything from wallets to technical innovations and education and everything in between. And, however, of course, being a member, I can start to see where improvements could begin to go forward. And among those topics that we could elaborate on could include like the life cycle support of projects that are in flight. Evaluation, I think we could do a lot more with. The role of RFPs, and also special roles that people could take and grow further within the scope of the granting committee.
Great. Ade?
So, of course, recognizing we are just in the third year of the excellent experiment of self-governing the funding from the block rewards, right? I have a bunch of points here I want to go over the talk, but I think I would like to start with wanting to see more structure and transparency around how proposals are evaluated. So we can expand on that.
Great.
Yeah, maybe I can supplement some of the delta I've seen.
Sure.
So in the first committee, this is 2001, we were just getting off the ground. Everything was very messy. It wasn't clear who should do what. But over time, I've seen that the current committee has really taken great strides to iron out the standard process. So whatever you see today is a great improvement from what it was. And Amber sounds like she has ideas about how to make that even smoother and more transparent to grantees. I think the RFP process was also a big deal. We were struggling to get good quality grants that we really wanted to fund. And so the solution they've come up with actively is to put up RFPs for specifically what we want. And I think Aditya also joining as somebody who is a grantee and being very technical has really added to the quality of our evaluation process. So I think that has been a major step forward as well. And I think the hiring of a security lead was extremely important as well, because we, at least on the first committee, we were always not very sure about how to evaluate the quality of what was being produced. So I think these are very important things that we shouldn't take for granted. We are a relatively new grant program in the grand scheme of things. Don't forget that all your grant council members are they're part-time. They're not full-time, and this compares very differently to other grant ecosystems. So just wanted to acknowledge what has been achieved by all of you, including Alex, you and your team, in collaborating with the grant committee.
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to mention as well, just to add on before we hear from you, is that we now actually have some data after some years of work, right? And so, we came into this fairly blind, and the first committee did their very best, and we had some growing pains, and it took some time to kind of hit our stride. But now the current committee is doing an absolutely fantastic job. There's obvious constraints with the Treasury, with unknown future, and all the other things that we've been talking about over the last few days. And in that context, I don't think the current committee could be doing a much better job. But now that we have this data that we can look back on and say, this is what's been successful. These are the grants that have been seen through to fruition, and these are the outcomes. And that's, extremely powerful. Again, to acknowledge that we haven't had that. And so it's been so much trial and error because there was no other way to really do it. But we're entering into a new phase, I think, at this point, which is great timing. It's good timing to have this kind of conversation where we can really start to look at the future. Josh.
Yeah, I love grants. I love the whole idea behind what the community put forth as an idea, just a few years ago, and to see it progress and to see the amazing work that's been done by the team. So thank you all that have kind of served in that role in working on the Zcash Community Grants. I do think you're right that we need to evolve it a little bit. So at the outset, at least me as a community member, and I'm pretty sure it's in Zip 1014 as well, there was kind of an expectation with the grants program that they were major grants intended to incubate kind of new projects that would come into the ecosystem that would potentially be dev fund recipients or something like that. But they would be significant contributors to Zcash and the ecosystem over a long period of time. And I think for the most part, I think that's been the case where a lot of grants have been given that way, but not all the grants have been given that way. So the foundation had done minor grants in the past, and this was the opportunity to do major grants, and therefore that's why we allocated 8% of the total dev fund to be able to, or 8% of the total mining rewards to be able to support those grants. The majority for more than ECC and more than ZF. I think it's important that we look at the structure moving forward. So, we've talked about the dev fund. I think there's broad support, at least the folks here, that there should be a new dev fund. But I wonder with the dev fund, there's some questions, is what should that dev fund support? And maybe that dev fund supports the support of the protocol and support of the things that keep Zcash working. And then the rest of the money goes to a speculative bucket that's part of a dev fund. So currently, ECC and the ZF can't apply for grants. But maybe that should change. So not that any one of those organizations should receive more money than what they're receiving today. That's not what I'm advocating for. But maybe there's a certain amount of funding as an expectation, for example, of maintaining Zebra D or Zcash D and those support functions within the community. But there may be speculative things that those organizations want or can do. And so maybe the grant funding could include those types of organizations in order to look at those speculative things. And like most, if you're investing, right, you're investing like if you're an angel investor or VC investor or that kind of thing. If we're investing in new projects to come up with the ecosystem, you need to have a portfolio because we know that like maybe one of those, one of 20 is gonna be a home run where it's gonna have a 10x, 100x return on investment. And maybe half of them are going to work out and be okay and good and deliver some good value. And then there's going to be some that fail. But you have a portfolio and you're making decisions based upon the risks that you want to take in strategic areas. And would love to see maybe a separation of some of those grants where you have a more speculative long-term focus with some of them. And then minor grants we're able to separate out from the major grants organization. To be able to support maybe shorter-term things that don't necessarily have some of the upside. So I'm sure there's tons of like other ideas and better ideas and all of that, but I think that we can now start to evolve this model and get a little bit more smart about how we kind of set up the structures and manage them moving forward.
Well, I have a follow-up question for Josh, but does anybody else want to have a follow-up question or want to add to that?
Sure. So I'd like to add that I do agree the current dev fund for the community-run ZCG has worked better for the short milestone and shorter grants. Like the funding is released for specific milestones reached and kind of not been able to reach the vision of the set in the 1014 ZIP, right? We wanted ongoing development of teams dedicated to Zcash to introduce more decentralization. So definitely I do want to touch back on the efficiency aspect of that as well, which is, like you brought up, that currently the ZCG is quite time constrained, and that also causes, shortcomings in communication and all kinds of things happen. So I would like to see efficiency in terms of not having an open application process, which is sudden surprises of this grant or that grant, and it just causes different kinds of things happening, right? So this is something I don't see other cryptocurrencies doing. They have like a time period of a couple of weeks or months or every quarter that they accept grants, and then they have a procedure to evaluate it, and then they share the results. Adding to that, there's also a perspective of retrospective. So we as a community should be able to talk about what went well with the grant, what didn't go well, and how we can improve it without attacking the builders. So yeah, that's around the efficiency aspect and improving the proposal and grant application process.
So with efficiency, what if we took rather than have the ZCG be more efficient on our org, what if we took that back out to the community and we did Gitcoin style grants where you can submit your idea to the community and use quadratic funding mechanisms to be able to fund those grants. So ultimately the community can start to participate in all this. So if they're beneath a certain threshold, it's like not within ZCG or like ZCG purview. It's like this is a smaller thing, it's a speculative thing, it's $50,000, it's $100,000, it's an educational video, it may be a community event or something like that. You put it up on Gitcoin, you let the community vote with their ZEC, and ultimately, and there could be matching. So that's part of the idea with the quadratic funding is maybe there's grant funding available to put to community things. So if you put up your grant, that grant community will automatically put up a certain threshold if it's matched or exceeded, and then the community votes with their ZEC. And then the grant committee doesn't have to even vet or think.
Yeah, that would work great for the short-term grants again. So I do support that idea. We can have a Gitcoin-style quadratic funding for shorter milestone-based grants, and then maybe the ZCG committee can focus on working closely with the long-term participants.
Yeah, I do think there's an inherent tension between the wanting to introduce a lot of new people and let new people try new ideas and let the community identify gaps in things that we need to be developed on the one hand, and then having these core functions that need to be maintained, and the value is lost if we spend a lot of money to build a system and then just let it decay. So having a separation between those two could be very useful, and also it might provide a kind of proving ground, because it's very difficult to evaluate a team who's suggesting something that's a very large, protracted in time project. Even if it's very good, how do we know that after the first milestone they might not discover that it's more difficult than they thought that they could deal with? So having smaller sort of telescoping projects separated from core functionality might be useful.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Michelle?
I do, but it's digressing a little. Do you want to keep going, then I'll come back?
Well, I'd like to make then 2 quick points. So one, on what Adi was saying, there is a lot to be learned from traditional grant funding, from foundations, family foundations. There's an entire grant-making world outside of crypto that's been around for many decades that there's various funding models which could be applied, including what you mentioned as far as, time, every 4 months there's a new grant period, and that's when they're evaluated. So I do think we could do a lot more looking outside of how we've traditionally looked at grants in this community. We could learn quite a bit. The other point I wanted to make, just in response to the first comment you were making, Josh, is that it's worth noting, for those that don't know, so ZCG is a committee underneath the Zcash Foundation, and so they have independent decision-making authority, but all of the administrative burden or tasks are on ZF. So when you were talking about the reason why the ECC and ZF can't receive grants is partially because of that scenario, that situation. So are you suggesting that ZCG, in what you initially suggested, that ZCG would move out from underneath and become an independent entity, or were you thinking of it in a different way?
Oh yeah, I'm a big advocate for it being an independent entity. And I understand that adds maybe some cost and complexity of having an independent entity versus fold in to the Zcash Foundation. But ultimately, I think it's good for the long-term decentralization. The more organizations that we can spawn off that are operating independently or able to. And I understand, like the Zcash Foundation, how you have your own constraints as a US-based 501c3. Which, like, for example, we had some issues where, like, an anon can't necessarily apply for a grant. But maybe through something like an external mechanism, there's some other mechanisms to allow for people in different parts of the world to be able to participate in these kinds of grant programs. One other point, like as it relates to efficiency and the size, like we have, like if you guys weren't aware, there's a Filecoin grant program that it was a agreement negotiated between ECC and Filecoin, and so that's managed separately. That's managed by ECC, and there's a representative from Filecoin/Protocol Labs that would kind of vet these grants that come in. Like I'm happy to announce we have allocated 100% of our grants within less than a year. I can't tell you all the details of that yet, but there were 2. But I will say one that we'll announce, which I'm super, super excited about. Sorry if I'm saying too much, Chris, but I'm very excited. It will get announced in the coming months, weeks to months, I think. But that particular grant took 14 months to pull together, actually. So the start of it, the genesis of it was some outreach and relationship building that took place between various parties, and then it was a lot of iteration on what is the scope, what's an appropriate scope, is everybody happy, is Filecoin happy, is this other third party happy, is ECC happy with the scope and the timelines and the deliverables. So that's very hard when you have ZCG as a volunteer-based, effectively part-time organization to be able to pull off kind of the nurturing of those style grants. So I'd love to be able to see, it's a very long answer to your question, I'd love to be able to see ZCG split off and have some more dedicated full-time support to be able to really steward this money towards some of these more impactful things.
My point of digression was actually about this. There were actually 2 parts of his response, right? One was about splitting into major and minor type of review, and the other was about ECC and ZF being able to apply. And I thought that one That one struck a chord because when I was on the panel, and I believe to some extent, with the current panel too, it may be hard at all points of time to have a really great assortment of projects to choose from. And it's possible, and perhaps this has even happened in the past 2-3 years since we've been established, that the best thing to invest in is not some random application, but perhaps something that's on ZF or ECC's list of priorities, but not quite the top, but they would like some extra funding to make what they're already working on so much better or so much faster. And so I think that's worthwhile to consider. It's not ideal. We will have to restructure to make this legally viable, but I think we're at a point, and we all acknowledge this, that we're in survival mode. And I think survival requires adaptation. If we don't adapt, one day perhaps we'll be dodo coin. Right? I think it's really important to think about what we're trying to protect now.
So I would like to add to the survival mode point. I think that goes back to the efficiency. I think this is something we really failed as at least my committee. When I started in Jan 2022, we had a combined treasury of $26 million, which reduced to around $3 million towards the end of the year. So we kind of failed to hedge. So I think even though we are in the bear market now with a $30 ZAC, we should still consider proactively hedging some ZAC in case things get even worse. So,
sure. I think my comment is not for a kind of current situation. We do have to set it up to work at different coin prices. With the current treasury, it may not be feasible to be expecting a large grant from the DCG, but we do need, I think, to set up our approaches or possibilities such for the maximization of cross-Zcash ecosystem benefit, which includes making sure that these orgs have the ability to pick low-hanging fruit if given extra resources.
All right. I mean, we still have funded large grants this year at a low ZAC price, and we still only hedge those coins when the grants are approved. So all I'm saying is, for the future, for the next 12 to 18 months till the next dev fund discussions happen, wherever we go, if we do want to maintain teams' ongoing contributions till the next dev fund, if we do hedge some amount, that might be a safe move.
I think it relates to the split-off idea as to how much control or how much thought process the ZCG is putting into the ongoing processes. When I first heard the idea of splitting off, I thought that's a terrible idea because it's already enough to review the grants. I think even before I started, I had not as much appreciation as I do now of the breadth of knowledge that one has to have when any submission comes in to try to evaluate the impact that it could potentially have, and as well as the technical details if it's technical. So there's a lot going on just in the review process by itself. Mm-hmm. But then as I deliberated on it further, I thought, and especially I think as we've taken on these special roles with the code auditor, with the outreach coordinator, and now with the community wallet developer, and it seems like these are prototypes for sort of expanding on ways that the ZCG needs to be thinking about its own operation and supporting itself in ways that are a lot larger than just having, the Zcash Foundation is providing an enormous amount of support, and that's intimidating, but there's more that we could do if we had our own sort of governance.
Yeah, I'd like to add some thoughts to this as well, which is I think we've talked a lot in the last couple of days about decentralization in the protocol, and to me, the easiest step for decentralization would be an independent grants committee or grants organization that was domiciled outside of the United States. I think the reality is is more challenging than that. If treasuries were at what they were a year or a year and a half ago, I think it would be an absolute no-brainer and something that we wouldn't even really be debatable at this point. It would be a step to take. But having looked at the numbers and knowing, I've been in every ZCG meeting, I think, in the last 2 years, just about, every public meeting. And so I know exactly what goes into, a lot of the work that everybody does. And it's enormous. And I obviously know the work my team puts into this, which is a huge part of what we do and does, to be fully honest, take away from other things we could be doing within to move ZF forward and support ZF operations. But the treasury piece of it can't be ignored. It's a huge part of it, and being independent would be extremely, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money to start up, it's a lot of money to maintain, because the administrative side has a knowledge level and requirement that is no less than the technical grant evaluation side. And not to overstate it, that there are ways that it could start small and grow, but like ML initially said, we're in survival mode, and to start over, to literally start over at a time when we're struggling to move forward, might not be the best timing.
Right, it feels anti-efficient.
Yeah, exactly. to go back to the original question.
Would it be similarly kind of legally dangerous to allow just the ECC to apply? Because I understand, obviously, ZF administers the ZCG, then applying for a grant, that's weird. But if ECC is separate, would that be a problem?
I wouldn't answer the legal part of it on stage like this, but what I would say is that it would set up a situation where a committee underneath, ZF is then giving money to or potentially granting money to ECC is maybe not the best situation for relations and other, it's just not ideal by any stretch. So yeah, I think it's more the possible conflict it would create that I would be concerned about. But there's other things, like one, we announced yesterday that we've created this organization in Cayman, which is obviously an offshore organization. Possibly one step, and this is not something we've discussed, I'm just throwing this out here, would be to move ZCG in its current form, exactly in its current form, under that organization, which would take care of one part of it, but it's a half measure, maybe leading to a full measure in the future if we, when we survive, when we thrive again, then it would be time, to fully break that connection, possibly, one possible outcome.
Add a note about the ECC. We did actually, at the ZCG, they funded several of ex-ZCC members, right? So various types. But they had to leave the ECC for that roles.
Yeah, absolutely. So any other comments on the efficiency impact part of this? Okay, I thought that might take some time, and I was right. So let's kind of move the conversation, but kind of still focus on this geographic thought. So what actions can be taken to expand the geographic reach of the Zcash funding ecosystem? Before we started up here today, we were talking about how great it is to hear from all parts of the world over this past morning. There's so many cool projects going on. There's so many interesting things happening within the protocol outside of the United States. So what can we do in all of our various roles to help prop up and support those entities, those individuals through grants?
I think, so to start with, the current ZCG is majority US-based, and that makes it a bit difficult to evaluate international proposals that I've seen. We tend to start with the assumption, unfortunately, that, hey, this outside group might be requesting too much money based on their location of where they're living, but the crypto has changed the landscape. The rates people ask around the world have been matched or exceeded the US-based rates in dollar terms. So I think that's the first notion we have to drop. And then the second thing I would like to talk about is I learned that just yesterday that someone from Filecoin actually went to meet their community in Ghana. So I think that was pretty bold and great for their community to connect with their local user base. While we don't have that, we haven't done anything in Africa, even though we have a lot of active users, at least seen in social media. So maybe someone can do a job and check if those people are real, and maybe we should pursue funding projects there.
One thing to quickly add to that is that we created Zcon Voices in part to go to where these other communities are. So we started with Brazil because there's such a huge, passionate, a functioning group in Brazil. Our dream, again, talking about Treasury, would be Zcon Nigeria or Zcon Kenya, somewhere within Africa. That is absolutely what we would love to do next, if we're able to. For that very reason, you have to go to where communities are. You have to show your face. You have to have in-person conversations, and then and get a feel for what's possible, what the potential really is, and not base your thoughts on assumptions or even just what you're getting in as far as grants go. Because again, one huge constraint of ZCG is that for the most part, because of resource constraints, you're waiting for people to come to you. And that's really challenging when you're waiting for communities who might not always feel heard, might not always feel like they're going to get the fair chance that they should through no experience with us specifically necessarily, but just in general. You need to go create that trust. You need to start a relationship, exactly like you're saying, Adi.
We need to, in addition to that, we need to reduce friction. We need to be honest, right? This stuff is too hard to use still. People don't have it in their own language. In some cases, people don't they struggle to read and write. And so, what does that mean in terms of the user experience? And are we building the tools that allow some of these communities to really kind of thrive and to educate and to take this out? Or are we creating barriers because they try it and it doesn't work, and they don't understand why it doesn't work, and they don't understand why balance isn't showing up, and they don't understand what sync means? It's too hard. And we also, ECC had partnered with Gitcoin some years ago, and we ran a hackathon. And we had people come in from all over the world to try to participate in the hackathon, and it sucked. Why did it suck? Because the developer tooling sucked, right? Because people couldn't easily build on top of Zcash. It wasn't even, so we can go out and try to understand, but I come from a certain context within the US. And so my context and what I understand is one thing. Somebody else, like our friends in Brazil, are in a different context with different needs, and maybe there's similar needs and there's similar core kind of ideology, but they have unique insight into the needs of the Brazilian people that I just don't have and I'll never completely understand. So how do we remove the friction to allow people in Brazil to build the solutions for Brazil on top of the platform? We need to improve documentation. Taylor's called this out multiple times. We need to improve developer documentation. We need to improve the SDKs and the tools that people can use so that they can actually use technology to be able to support their needs in their own context. I'd love to be able to see grants that go to support those folks to be able to build better. But we as core protocol developers and that are putting that out there have to do a better job of making it easy.
Totally agree on that point. It's about prioritizing the right tech that we need, documentation, wallet state syncing, the fact that the wallets work around the world, and then going on from there before funding other initiatives.
Yeah, I remember when I first started having wallet sync issues, the only reason anyone could answer my question is because I could text the people building the wallets. I think we do need to improve our communication to help people understand what on earth is happening from different angles. I think the original question that was asked that led to this kind of geographic diversification question was about certain projects in certain parts of the world that feel like they're not getting enough attention. They've applied, but presumably they've been denied. And I would just suggest to anyone watching who may have similar questions, put yourselves in the shoes of the people on the grant panel. We're not simply looking to, allocate money to whomever asks for money for some wonderful marketing campaign. We're thinking about the ROI on every grant. So if you can show that you commit to, with the first tranche, you have certain results, certain usage, certain users, then it becomes an easier conversation when they are discussing internally. So I just encourage you to put yourselves in the shoes of somebody on the panel having a responsibility to effectively give out grants. Marketing grants are not necessarily always well written because it tends to it tends to be a little bit amorphous in terms of what benefits come back to the Zcash ecosystem.
Excellent point. I agree with what you said too, Josh. I would add to it that understanding use cases instead of making assumptions on use cases, I think that's a huge thing. And again, it goes back to listening and having an open communication channel with individuals and communities in different geographic areas. And I think, again, using Brazil as an example, we now have this incredible base of passionate users there who we have created these amazing communication links with. And so, it's on us and it's on our friends in Brazil to work together to really start to ratchet that up and grow it and understand, what can we build to help increase adoption there? What can we build to help increase development and tap into use cases that we've all talked about for a long, long time? We all know the potential use cases, and we're all interested in them, but we haven't seen any of those really come to fruition in the places where they were needed most. And I think we need to ask ourselves some hard questions on that. And it does come back. It starts with communication and a real understanding and listening to what is really needed.
And communication comes with open channels, right? And then again, that feeds into the time and efficiency. Do you have enough time to get that communication going? Enough time for retrospectives on certain programs?
Yep. Time to even learn, to learn from things, because you can sit down and you can say,
right,
what did we learn from this? Absolutely. Any other comments on this question?
Yeah, I just want to add to Emel's point about if you're a stranger to the community and the grant committee is trying to figure out what kind of value you might be adding so that we can decide whether or not to allocate funds. One way that you can begin to develop a reputation is to look at, for example, ZecHub or Free2Z and just participate in the community conversation so that you begin to understand what other people are doing and where your contributions might be best made.
Awesome. Well, I want to make sure we have time for kind of closing comments, but maybe really kind of quickly we can just talk about this last question, which is how can Zcash ecosystems grant programs further contribute to decentralization within the protocol? We've obviously discussed the very obvious one, but does anybody have others to add to that?
The obvious one being disconnecting from CF, or is that what you mean?
Oh, that's, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that was my comment, that I think it's the lowest hanging fruit of decentralization, yes.
Yeah, it's to decentralize away from ZF as its own independent body and engaging with the community that way. And then, again, I think my personal belief is that organization should focus on building and incubating larger projects. So I think Kedit is a great example of their potential. Now, it's a lot of money that's been given to Kedit, and I think it's still to be determined, right? Because they're still working to roll something out, if that bet is worth it. But that's the kind of bet. Like, we've had others, and it's not to criticize our kind of former folks that have worked on Tor with Artie, right? And so that was given $1.3 million. It's a significant amount of money. It's unclear to me how that is ever going to be a kind of long-term benefit to the Zcash community. I'd rather see that kind of money go to other organizations that are committed on a longer term through the Zcash Community Grants piece, but it's going to take a lot of work and maybe more time than they currently have available today.
Well, there's another inherent tension there, because if you're a team that wants to do something with a big goal and aspiration, you really need to be able to dedicate a lot of time and hire employees who are willing to commit for a long time. And so if you don't know in advance how much granting you're going to get, then it could be hard to commit to making something. But on the other hand, as the granting committee, we don't want to make a large commitment until we've seen that the process is starting to move forward. And I'm not quite sure the best way to get over that from both sides.
So what if it's like, because the ZCG has done this maybe, and maybe you have good examples of where they've done it, but you incubate those things, right? If somebody does a pilot or proof of concept and we're going to say we're going to fund 50K, the goal is that we're actually going to fund $1 million, and if it's just a 50K project, it's actually not probably worth it, or it's likely not going to have the same level of impact. So we're going to fund 50K for a pilot to prove that out there's some kind of delivery mechanism, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then maybe they have some longer term, bigger funding.
Is that
Right,
not
so-
what has happened?
So that's nice from the ZCG side, but then
Yeah.
on the team that wants to do it, how are they going to find people who are committed if they can't give them a promise that they'll be employed?
No, I totally get that, but that's also kind of a startup mentality, right? So like having kind of grown up in the startup world and played that game, like funding is never inevitable, and you've got to go earn that next funding. So you can't I can go, especially if I'm trying to bootstrap it or get a seed, then you have employees that may be taking less money, they're taking more risk because they believe in the thing, or they have an anticipation of some further
That's
upside.
actually what we did on the first panel. We were quite insistent. Zcash Media is one example. They've gotten a lot of money now, but back then they applied for the same amount. We said no. So I wonder what the process is like right now. Are we pushing back on kind of staging and tiering?
Well, right now, the situation with the funding is one of the major constraints, and it makes us more reluctant to commit to larger projects. And we've had some situations where we've done a kind of research phase to look into the details or design of what a project would entail before going any farther.
Okay.
So any other comments on decentralization before we wrap up?
Yeah, so for me, decentralization for protocol means the actual protocol as to how many developers are actually making pull requests to the core clients, Zcash and ZBRD. And I would like to see more teams. We do have Kedit now, and it's about how do we attract more cryptographers and developers to start contributing to the consensus and start taking part in the conversations about what do we see the future for Zcash with the proof of stake and or keeping it as proof of work, the emission curve, the coin issuance, all that kind of stuff.
There's maybe one more, and it's maybe similar to what we did with Filecoin. So the Filecoin ECC grants program was Filecoin funded. And so are there things, like one of the things that we've talked about within the Zcash community is like, for example, all the amazing scientific work that gets done within this community and then other projects use, which is awesome. It's great that we're providing that benefit. But are there mechanisms where we can engage those other communities to bring more grant dollars into the Zcash community by kind of getting away from just the pure Zcash? So the thing with Filecoin grant is it needed to be inclusive of both. So it needed to benefit the Filecoin community and it needed to benefit the Zcash community. Maybe there's more opportunities. There's some deep, there's some treasuries out there that are just unbelievably deep and looking for also places to grant fund. And there might be an interesting way to create some intersections if somebody's reaching out or engaging with some of those other kind of foundations or community groups.
Well, so maybe starting with ML and just working this way, just final thoughts as we wrap up this panel. I feel like we could talk about this for another hour or two.
Yeah, just two. And the first one is, I think we're all trying our best to evolve. And since the last time we discussed, I think we've evolved in great directions. We've made great progress. I expect next year, as we continue to struggle, we will struggle better. We'll be at a better point, I'm confident, given what I've seen. I also wanted to give a shout out to Han. He is our one-man rocket ship, and we're really happy to have you in the community, to have people who really care and are really good. So we'd love to find more Hans.
Josh?
Hey, man, I don't have any further thoughts. We'll just
Amber, go ahead.
I also agree that I think we could go on for a very long time. I think one of the things that Addie brought up that we should look into further is about the idea of having grants come in with a deadline or maybe a window so that we have time to compare them. And I think this is especially important during times when the budget is more strained. And I guess more largely, think of ways to be more adaptable to the value of the coin, because when we start out, say at the beginning of the year, and we're kind of projecting what we'll be able to do, it may not be true 3 months later, and that's been hard to adapt to.
Great. Adi?
Yeah, agree. It has to be, I'll touch my point back on the transparency and formal structure of the grant review process and retrospectives. It is no fun as a grant applicant to send in your proposal after you worked on it for so long and then just being delayed for 6 to 7 weeks, and you have other grants being front-run before that and then being told that we don't have money for you. So I think formal structure, more transparency around what decisions were taken, what was the criteria applied, how much money was paid for each team member and such might help reduce contentious things happening.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say to wrap up that we have so many huge things to talk about in this community. There are so many big decisions that need to be made, and I feel like this area is somewhere we can come together on, and we can really use as a way to spring forward and start this next phase, because we all want the same thing. We all want this to go in a direction that it's supportive and grows the community, grows the ecosystem. And maybe this is an area for common ground where we can really sit down and say, this is what we've learned. This is how we're going to apply it. This is what's coming next, and we use it to hopefully filter into all the other conversations and things that need to get done in a pretty short time frame. That started right around now. So I just want to say thank you to you all. This was amazing. Wish we could keep going, but it's time to wrap it up. So.
And Daniel and Danica, who have been great supports to the ZCG.
Absolutely.